Okay, so I have the case soaking in hot water for about 8 to 10 minutes or so. Whenever you're using this part of the boil out, make sure you're wearing insulated gloves. In fact, I have my clinical gloves so I don't get my hands dirty, because there's a lot of people that are using these gloves, so I don't know what's in them. And make sure you're wearing your proper PPE. Eye protection, face mask, protective equipment, lab coats, and so forth. So we're going to remove our case from hot water. Make sure when you're carrying it over, don't just grab it from this little ring here. Grab it with both hands. So we're going to go over to the bench. I'm going to undo my compress. Set that to the side. And I'm going to place some paper towels on the bench because I anticipate some wax possibly melting here. Therefore, it's easier to clean up. So I'm going to start, it doesn't matter which one, but keep your flasks upright, and with the back of your plaster knife, just gently pry it. And because there's no undercuts, it comes apart rather easily. So we have just sufficient warming of the wax. Now I can pry out my light-cure base. I can set that to the side and do the same thing with the lower. One thing I didn't show in the previous video, the little stone that was that oozed out from the top and the sides, you can just scrape that away with a knife, or I just use my mixing spatula to scrape that away before you put it inside your compress. You can certainly pry it apart with your hands, although I would recommend you place the flasks upright and gently open. If they don't open from one side, then go to the other. These are not so challenging. These are full upper and lower cases, but when you start working with partial cases, these are a little more sensitive. So once again, gently pry out the light-cure base. Take note, make sure that your knife does not poke all the way through and damage the tissue-bearing surface of the cast. So from this point on, what I'm going to do, I have the basket, this carrying basket that fits over the boil out, and I'm just going to position them in the same manner. Again, I'm going to put my upper on the right because that's just what I do, then my lower on the left, so they fit in there as a group. So we're going to take this basket as it is with the splash guard towards us, so that way we prevent any water splashing. The other thing we want to have with us when we go over there, we want to have our toothbrush. And I have here a solution of soap and water. It's about 10 to 1, 10 parts water, 1 part regular dish soap. And I'm able to spray it, as you can see, and I'll do my final rinse and little wipe down with my toothbrush. We also have a kettle over here that's ready to go. So I just pressed it one more time. So the final rinse will be with clean water. And as you'll see over at the boil out, the water is not so clean. So I'm going to carry this over as it is. And place it over the spouts. And turn on the button for the pump. And you want to hover the spouts over the individual flasks back and forth, and maybe rock it back and forth. A lot of steam. And drain the excess water to see what's going on. I do have a little bit of residue of wax over here, right back down here, and maybe over here, so I need to go a little bit more. And that's good. Now, while the flasks are still moist or wet, I'm going to spray them with the soap solution and take my toothbrush and gently go over, just wipe everything over. Make sure there's no residue of wax on there at all, otherwise you're not going to get the separator to adhere very well. You can certainly remove each individual flask, and you can see here there's a little bit of residue of wax, and that's gone. And of course we're going to have a final rinse with our clean water from the kettle. So I can place it back on there, and I'll grab the kettle and come back. And final rinse with the kettle. Over individual flask. I'm about halfway through the kettle, so I'm going to use all of the water. It's very important that we have no residue of wax on here. You can certainly give it one more spray. I got a little bit of water left just to be on the safe side. One more little wipe. Don't use a stiff brush here, use a soft toothbrush. If you have a hard time getting in there, you can certainly pick it off the tray and give it a wipe down this way. Back in here, and I'll do my final rinse with hot water, clean water. Okay, so before I remove the basket, you want to turn the basket over, drain any water that's lying on the bottom. And from here on, we're going to move over to the bench once more. Remove all of this and bring each flask over. And now we're ready to apply our separator. Just so I have a little more tactile sense, I'm going to remove one of my insulating gloves and just use the one to hold it so I can get a better feel for my brush. And we're going to apply a generous amount of separator throughout. And take the time to really work the separator inside the fine little crevices as a result of the wax up. We're going to take a little bit of paper here, and I'm going to just rest this flask up against the backsplash here so the excess separator drains. And I'll move on to the next one. And it's important that we apply the first layer of wax while the flasks are still hot and the models are hot. We got a little bit of investment that chipped off there. That's not a big deal. Let's off the denture surface. That's going to get filled in with acrylic. We're just going to simply trim that away. And move on to this. And then after it's separated, we'll give it a final look and assess our investment. Make sure you work it in here. So a good brush goes a long way. A soft bristle brush works very well. You don't want to have anything stiff here. Let that drain. And finally, our last one before it gets cold. All right, and we'll set that upright and let that drain. Now, the separator doesn't necessarily drain completely. You might get some separator still stuck in there. You see those little blotches of separator. So what you can do, you can go to an air hose and just give it a very gentle spray, just to thin out that part of the separator. Now I can leave it flat, and once again you can either spray it or you can take your brush, wipe off some of the excess here, and go back and dab away some of the excess separator. Remember, if your separator is too thick and you leave on an excessive amount, it will act as a spacer. So I'm just going to go and blow it with the nozzle. And once again, make sure it's a very gentle stream of air. Just dab the back of the teeth here and a little bit back here. That looks pretty good. Now, generally a good separator will work very well just by having one application. And it all depends, the thickness of your separator, the type of separator that you use, but overall what you want to see is you want to see a glossy finish to the stone. And we have that here. So everything is nice and glossy. That means I have a very fine film of separator, probably no more than maybe 10 to 20 microns of thickness. And that's probably excessive. Probably less than that. Just gonna go back and dab some of the excess off. And while this is cooling off, we can certainly clean up our mess. And line up my flasks as before, upper on the right, lower on the left. And looking at the flasks overall, I have little, if any, flash of stone between the lower half of the flask and the upper half of the flask. If you did, be sure to scrape that away before you even boil it out. But I didn't, so I didn't bother with it. But if I had excess stone because some way, somehow, I wasn't gripping it hard enough and the stone seeped between the two halves, you'd have to scrape that away before you boil out the case. So we have a nice glossy look. We have a high degree of detail. All of our wax up around the teeth. So it's a true replica of what we did before in wax. So if I pack this correctly, I should have success in terms of duplicating my wax up in acrylic. Now, it might be a good idea after the flasks have cooled down a little bit. I tend to do a very fine skim coat of separator on top of the initial layer, and they'll stick to each other. So now you can see that this glossy appearance is even more evident now. So I can sleep a little bit better at night when this is curing, and to prevent any stone adhering to the acrylic. So I'll do that with the lower model too, and I'll do it on the top half as well. So dab the brush, wipe off the excess a little bit. So it's a very, very fine coat. So we're not trying to build up the thickness of the separator here. We're just trying to improve it a little bit all around the sides. So we have a nice glossy look to it. You can do a little bit in here. This one, you're gonna have to build it up again. All over. And before the separator gets dry, we're gonna go over to the air nozzle and we're gonna gently spray the excess away. So if we compare the two, the before and after, this is one layer of separator, this is two. This looks a little more shiny than the other one because it's got two layers. Could I possibly get away with one layer? Well, it remains to be seen because I'm going to leave one layer on this one and two layers on the lower. But just to be on the safe side, I'm going to take my brush and possibly dab away any excess separator on the back of the teeth and interproximately and smooth it out. Wipe it against the paper. So I would advise that you get a fresh batch of separator when you're doing this, certainly when you're separating your flasks, to ensure that you have the same consistency of separation. Just a fine layer on top of the palette here, in between here, so a bit of a different method. Just allowing the brush to get all the way down and over the rest of the investment. So we have a gloss finish to this. And that looks pretty good. Now, ideally, this should be allowed to cool down to room temperature so that the flask should not be hot or warm to the touch. And then we can start roughening the back of the teeth and start packing acrylic. And if you do it on the same day, whether it's an hour or 2 or 3 later, the separator works very well. You might be running a risk of allowing the separator to dry overnight and packing the case the next day. If that's the case, if you're not going to be ready to pack the case the same day, you should be boiling out the case and separating the case the day that you're going to pack it. So don't leave it overnight, because sometimes the separator gets very flaky and dry and is not as effective as it is when it's, within the first 2-3 hours of packing it. All right, so on the next video, we're going to show some roughening of the teeth and the actual packing of the acrylic.